Hi, I'm Scott Mansell and welcome to Driver 61's University Series. In today's tutorial we're going to be taking a look at the most fun handling characteristic, oversteer. So firstly, what exactly do we mean when we're talking about oversteer? Well, it may also be referred to as being loose or rotation when the rear tyres of the car will break traction before the front and the car is literally oversteering. So if you remember the tutorial on understeer, we were talking about turning the car in and the car wasn't turning as much as the driver wanted to. Well, oversteer is the opposite. It's when you turn the car in, the rear becomes light and the car actually turns more than you want it to into the corner. Now, having a little bit of oversteer in your race car or your track car is actually a good thing. It can be very, very quick. In fact, it's the quickest way around a track. However, if you have too much oversteer, then it can cause you to be quite slow through a corner. So the right amount of oversteer, in my opinion, it depends on the car and the circuit that you're driving on. But if you have to turn the steering wheel opposite to the way that the car's going and you go beyond the straight point of the steering wheel, then for me this is a little bit too much oversteer and you'll actually be losing lap time. Now, in terms of these diagrams here, you can see that the orange line is the intended racing line for the car in question, and the green line is the oversteer line. So the orange line comes through this kind of arc here, and with some oversteer on the green line here, you can see that the car's actually turning into the corner too much. So if we move on to the second diagram here, which shows an almost right-hand hairpin, again we have the orange line, which is the intended line, and the green line, which is the oversteer line. So the orange line brakes, slows down, comes into the apex as we would expect, and then begins to accelerate towards the exit point. The green line, the oversteer line, the car comes in and as the driver turns in towards the apex, the rear will feel light and it will start to rotate, it will start to oversteer as those rear tyres break traction before the front. Then as the driver makes the apex, because he's managed to get it into the apex on this occasion, but on the exit, as the driver gets on the accelerator, the car really begins to slide at the rear and it oversteers all the way out, and you can see that the car turns in and may even spin towards the inside of the corner. So how does a car feel when it begins to oversteer on track? Well, the first thing to say is that it can be a little bit nerve-wracking when the car breaks traction for the first time, when it begins to oversteer. Now, if you take a look at our previous tutorial on grip, I'll explain how to gradually increase your speed through a corner so that when the car finally does break traction, it doesn't take you by surprise. Now, when the car does break traction at the rear for the first time, you'll feel it in your backside, you'll feel it through the seat of the car, and you'll feel the rear begin to break way and the car begin to rotate around the front tyres, and you'll feel it all through your body. The next thing that will happen is that you'll have an urge to apply some opposite lock. So opposite lock is, say you're turning into a left-hand corner, the rear begins to slide, you actually need to put in some opposite lock to correct the oversteer. This can be quite a difficult thing to do, and I've sat next to many new drivers on track. The first thing that they do when a car oversteers on them is to overcorrect the slide. They'll actually apply too much opposite lock and will have a bit of a tank slapper. Now, with more and more experience and more experience in the car sliding at the rear, these movements and the opposite lock that the driver will apply becomes more and more refined. So really it's just a matter of having more and more seat time at the edge of grip to really refine your movements into the opposite lock that you're putting into the car. So what are the causes of oversteer and how can we change our driving style to correct these problems? Well, the first problem can be if you try to enter the corner too quick. There's a certain limit to how quickly a car can go through a corner. And if you try and enter the corner too quickly, then something's going to give way. Depending on your driving technique and the setup of the car could understeer, as we spoke about in the last tutorial, or it could oversteer. Now, the way to fix entering a corner too quickly is to obviously just go in a little bit more slowly. Not so slowly so that the car's not doing any work, but slowly enough so that we actually keep everything tidy, we don't get too much oversteer, and we can get back on the accelerator nice and early and get a good exit coming out of the corner. The next issue that we could have is if you leave the brakes on too long as you're entering a corner, otherwise known as trail braking, which we're going to cover in a later tutorial. Now, if you take a look at these two diagrams here, the first one shows the platform of the car, as we discussed in the weight transfer tutorial. The first one describes the platform of a car that you may be leaving the brakes on for too long as you enter the corner. And the second one shows the following lap where we're trying to rectify this problem and distribute the weight better. So the first one here, you can see that we've just shown the weight distribution underneath. Now this is just a made-up figure just to demonstrate through these diagrams. But we get on the brakes, the nose of the car dives, the weight of the car moves to the front, and so the grip of the car moves to the front as well. So in this diagram, if we were to turn in at this point, the front has 75 units of grip and the rear has 25. Well, we try and turn the car into the corner with this weight distribution and this grip distribution, but then we're rear limited. The rear of the car begins to slide and we can't enter the corner as quickly as we want. So the following lap, we're thinking, well, last time I tried to keep the brakes on a little bit too long and I couldn't get through the corner with all of this speed. So this time I'm going to come off the brakes a little bit earlier so that the front of the car rises slightly and we transfer some of the grip to the rear of the car. As you can see in this diagram, we've come off the brakes a little bit earlier. Now we've only got 70 units of grip at the front, but we have 30 units of grip at the rear. So we're transferring some of that grip to the rear. And now we can get through the corner. So if you're trail braking into a corner and you turn in and the rear feels really light and it's limiting you from going quicker through the corner, well, the next lap, just try and come off the brakes a little bit earlier and it may well be that you can carry this speed through the corner. Now this is something that happens very, very often with even good racing drivers. They just try and carry the brakes into the corner too far and it restricts them at the rear. It's a very difficult thing to get around because you're thinking, well, I can't get through the corner at this speed, so how will releasing the brakes earlier help me? Well, it's because of the weight distribution that we just described. The third issue could be if you're turning into the corner too sharply. So you're arriving at a corner and you just turn in a little bit too hard. The weight of the car will transfer to the outside too harshly and the outside tyres will cause a slide. Now it could turn into understeer, again depending on the setup of the car. It's just as likely to turn it into oversteer, especially if you're continuing to trail the brakes into the corner. Now the remedy for this is obviously to smooth out your steering inputs. And as we always speak about with Driver 61 here, being as smooth as possible will make you as quick as you possibly can on the circuit. Now the fourth issue is very similar to coming into a corner on the brakes. But for example, if you have a corner where you don't necessarily need to brake, but you're just lifting off the accelerator, we can still have this same issue with weight transfer. If you lift off the accelerator too hard, the weight of the car will transfer to the front too quickly and will remove the weight away from the rear very quickly as well. And so the rear will begin to slide. If this is a problem where you're not using the brakes but you're just lifting off, just try a smoother lift and it may well be that you can carry a little bit more speed into the corner. The fifth issue that we may have is if you get on the accelerator in a rear-wheel drive car too hard. So if we take a look at this diagram here, you can see the blue line shows a accelerator trace, a throttle trace against distance, where they've got on the accelerator quite hard. The rear will have stepped out. They'll have to lift off the accelerator to reduce the amount of wheel spin and the oversteer, and then they get back on the accelerator. Now the red line here shows a quicker driver who's got on the accelerator more smoothly and then been able to get to full throttle earlier and propel himself out of the corner a little bit quicker. Now it's really this first part of the acceleration phase that's the most important, the transition from the brake pedal back to the accelerator. We're only talking 10-15% throttle here, but it's critical, absolutely critical, that when you first introduce the accelerator, it's silky, silky smooth. If you just blip the accelerator a little bit too much, then it will likely slide at the rear and you'll be costing yourself lap time. Now the final issue that we could have is just simply having a poorly set up car. We're going to go into some setup details a little later in this tutorial, but if the rake of the car is too much, if the rear springs are too heavy, you may just have a naturally oversteering car, and it will be time to talk to your engineer to try and sort this out. As I spoke about at the beginning of this tutorial, when a car first breaks away or when a driver feels oversteer for the first time, it can be a little bit scary. So obviously we want to do as many things as we can to make sure that when a car slides at the rear, when it oversteers, it's as predictable as possible. Now, I went over this in our previous grip tutorial, but basically the smoother that your inputs into the car are, the more progressive an oversteer will be. If you turn the car in really hard, well, the weight of the car will transfer very quickly and very harshly, and it means that the tyres are much more likely to break away more quickly. So if you make all of your inputs, that includes coming off the brake smoothly, turning the car into the apex smoothly, and again getting back on the accelerator smoothly, then when the car does finally break traction and reach the edge of grip, it will break away nice and smoothly. Imagine pushing somebody over. If you push them hard, they're very likely to fall on the ground. But you can put the same pressure into them and load them up very smoothly, and they can still remain standing. So just think about this with your driving. Any hard movements means that the car will slide very aggressively. Make it smooth, and it's much more likely to rotate on you in a more drawn out fashion. Now, we can use oversteer, and good drivers do use oversteer to their advantage when they're driving on circuit. If you take a look at this diagram just here, it shows a right-hand hairpin, for example, Druids at Brands Hatch. Now, it's difficult to have a well-balanced car through the whole corner. If you remember the 6 phases of the corner tutorial that we went through earlier in this series, it explains how a car's balance transfers all the way through a long corner, especially a hairpin like this. And it's difficult to keep the car or the 4 tyres all working at 100% all of the time through one of these long corners. Now, in this diagram, in this example, you can see the green line is the traditional line. It's a line that you may see at a racing school where they're explaining to people first time on track the correct line through a hairpin. And they will say to come around the outside, to open up the exit and straight line the exit as much as possible. This is okay, but this is for drivers who aren't using 100% of the grip available to the car. The car won't be sliding around, the car won't be moving underneath the driver. If you take a look at the orange line here, it's more of a V. You can see that the line comes in a bit earlier. We don't make the first apex still. We don't make the apex early on the curb here, but we bring the car in. We actually trim off a little bit of distance, but we help the braking into the corner. It means we can brake into the corner a little bit further, but we do have more turning to do in this point. Now, what we're actually doing here is trailing the brakes into the corner, and we're actually creating a little bit of oversteer just before we get to the apex. So we're bringing the car in towards the apex, keeping the weight down on the nose, keeping the grip towards the front of the car. And just before we get to the apex, we're going to actually force the rear of the car to slide. We're going to cause some oversteer, and this helps the car to turn more quickly just in this area here than if it wasn't using or overstepping all of the grip available. So at this point, the rear of the car is sliding, turning the car more quickly, so we actually angle the car towards the exit of the corner sooner, and then we can get back on the accelerator while the car's in a straight line and really nail that exit. So it may be that the setup of your car is just causing the oversteer problem that you may have. Now, we're going to go into setup in much more detail in later tutorials, but I couldn't do a tutorial on oversteer without mentioning setup. Now, the first thing to say is that if you're not really experienced, please don't touch the setup of your car if you don't know exactly what you're doing. You need to be able to feel what's happening with the car beneath you. You need to be very consistent, and you need to be able to translate that information to your engineer, who can then make the setup changes. So please just be very careful before you dive in there and make any setup changes. Now, there's a table in the article below that lists some handling problems that you may have and what parts of the car or parts of the setup you can change to try and cure that. So that's it for this tutorial on Oversteer. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please share it through your social media, and I'll see you next time.